I've been studying near-death experience for almost 50 years now. I didn't start off to do that. I was raised in a materialistic scientific household where I assumed the mind was created by the brain, and I never gave any thought to anything spiritual or religious. And when I went through college and medical school, I had that mindset that everything we think and feel is created by the brain. And then in my early days as a psychiatrist, I was confronted by patients who claimed that they had died or almost died, and during that time, when they were clearly unconscious, had left their bodies and could describe for me things that happened at other locations outside the body, and they described them accurately. And I couldn't make any sense of that. But these were patients, so I thought, well, they're just crazy. They're just making these things up, they're imagining them. But I started hearing more and more. And then in 1975, after I'd been collecting some of these cases, one of my colleagues, Raymond Moody, published a book called Life After Life, which gave us the name near-death experience and described what they were like. And I realized for the first time, these weren't just psychiatric patients who were describing this, but normal people all over the world were having this. Being a scientist, I couldn't understand this at all. It didn't make any sense to me. But I figured this is my obligation to try to understand what's going on here. True scientists don't run away from things they don't understand, they run towards them. So I started collecting more and more cases and trying to understand what's going on in the brain to cause this. And the more cases I collected over the decades, the harder they became to understand. And I finally sort of lost patience with trying to find different physiological explanations and started looking for other things as well. And what was most astounding to me as a psychiatrist was not the experience itself, but how it dramatically changed people's lives. Psychiatrists work for a long time with people to try to make small changes in their lives. And here you have an experience which, in a second or a fraction of a second, can totally transform someone's attitudes, beliefs, values, behavior. That's a tremendously powerful experience. We didn't have a word in English until 1975 to describe these experiences. If you look back through the literature of ancient Greece and Rome, you see lots of accounts of what we now call near-death experiences. Pliny the Elder, the Roman historian in the 1st century, wrote of many cases like this. And we have them going back through the centuries from ancient European cultures, from China and Japan, from Native American cultures, from the Pacific Islands, all over the world, from India, that sound the same as the experiences we hear today. Cultural expectations, religious expectations do not seem to affect whether you're going to have a near-death experience or what kind you have. They're the same all over the world. We restrict the name near-death experience to these profound mystical experiences that happen when someone is very close to death, or sometimes when their hearts stop and they're pronounced dead. And they include features that are very hard to explain. For example, a sense of overwhelming peace and well-being. This is in the context of being close to death, which is often very painful and very frightening. But they're suddenly overwhelmed by peace and well-being. And they also have a sense of being one with everything and feeling a sense of unconditional love from some outside source, which they sometimes identify as a deity. They also find their thoughts going faster than ever before, which is strange because their brains are not functioning, and yet they're thinking faster than ever. Their thoughts are clearer. They often have a review of their entire lives in a matter of seconds, and a sense of understanding everything that was unknown to them before. They also often have a sense of their perceptions, vision, and hearing being much more acute and much more vivid than ever before. They report seeing colors they'd never seen on Earth, hearing sounds they'd never heard. They sometimes report extrasensory perception, seeing things and hearing things that were beyond the range of their senses. They also report sometimes visions of future events which later come true. And they usually would talk about a sense of leaving the physical body and being outside the body and watching what's going on. For example, the doctor's trying to revive them. In the more elaborate cases, they often report leaving the physical world and going to some other realm or dimension where they may encounter other spiritual beings, sometimes deceased loved ones, sometimes religious or spiritual figures. And eventually they come to a border or a point of no return beyond which they can't keep going and still come back to life. When Raymond Moody wrote his book in 1975 that described near-death experiences, he listed 15 features. A couple of years later, I tried to develop a scale to measure near-death experiences. So I looked in all the literature about that, and I found more than 80 features that people had described as part of a near-death experience. So I gave this list of 80 people to a bunch of near-death experiencers and had them pick the ones that were most important. And then I gave that list, they whittled down, to a bunch of researchers and asked them which ones they thought were the most reliable. And then I gave that back to the near-death experiences. I went back and forth until I came down with a list of 16 different features which I thought were the most important. I called it the NDE scale for near-death experience. It was published in 1983. Which is quite old now, but it's been used in all around the country, all around the world, in 20 different languages, in thousands of studies. And it's used to quantify, to measure how deep a near-death experience is. We use the term near-death experience, or NDE, to refer to this mystical experience that happens in the context of coming close to death or actually being pronounced dead. However, it is very similar to other mystical experiences that have been occurring throughout the centuries from a variety of ways. Some people, some religious traditions have developed techniques for inducing these experiences. For example, using meditation or using psychedelic drugs that occur naturally in the wild, or by doing various drumming and dancing techniques, sensory deprivation techniques, going out into the desert on vision quests. And they all can produce a mystical experience that sounds very much like a near-death experience and can have the same profound after effects. But for research purposes, we use near-death experience to mean just those that occur around the close brush with death. People have tried to estimate how many near-death experiences they occur, and studies done in the United States, in the United Kingdom, and in Germany have come up with a number of roughly 5% of the general population. Now that's a lot, that's 1 out of every 20 people. So someone in your family, in your workplace, in your classroom has probably had a near-death experience. And I think that may be an underestimate because many people are not willing to talk about their near-death experience. For those of us who haven't had a near-death experience, it sounds to us like a dream, like it couldn't possibly happen. And yet people who have the experience say it is not dreamlike at all. It is realer than real. People have told me over and over again, talking to God or talking to my deceased mother was more real to me than talking to you right now. And they say, talking to you now is more real than a dream, the way that experience is more real than talking to you. So there's no confusion in their minds. They don't see it as a dream at all. We find that near-death experiences are pretty much the same for men, women, people of different ethnic groups, people of different religious cultures all over the world. However, how they interpret the near-death experience may be colored by their cultural or religious background. Most people who have near-death experiences say, I can't describe it to you. There are just no words to describe what happened. And of course we say, great, tell me about it. So we could have forced them to distort it, and they use metaphors to describe it. For example, they will say, I went to heaven and I saw these pearly gates, and they say, of course it wasn't really pearly gates, that's just the way I'm talking to you about it. Many people around the world will talk about encountering a warm, loving being of light that makes them feel loved and accepted. And if you happen to come from a Judeo-Christian culture, you may label that as God. If you come from a culture that doesn't have a monotheistic God, they won't use that term. They may call it something else, or they may just call it a being of light. And in fact, many Westerners who are raised in a religious Christian background will tell me, I'm going to call this God so you know roughly what I'm talking about. But this was not the God I was taught about in church. It's very different. It's much bigger than that. The question is always raised that whether these are near-death experiences are a result of our expectations. You know, we think we're dying, so we of course imagine what we were told to occur. And that is a plausible explanation to put forward. But we've collected some data to test that. For example, most people now are familiar with the model that Raymond Moody proposed, leaving your body, feeling peaceful, going through a tunnel, having a life review, seeing deceased loved ones, and so forth. But we actually have collected here at the University of Virginia many cases of what we now call near-death experiences before Moody published his book in the 1960s and early 1970s, before anyone knew what they were. And we've gone back and looked at those early cases and compared them to matched cases now, matched on age, gender, how close they came to death, how they came close to death. And we compared all the features that Moody described, all 15 features, before he described them and after he described them. And there was no difference. Everything he described was there before he told us about them. Furthermore, if you look in the ancient Greek and Roman literature, centuries before anyone knew what a near-death experience, you see the same features. So it does not seem to be affected by your expectations. Now, of course, how you interpret what you experience can be affected by your expectations. These are normal events that happen to normal people under abnormal circumstances when you're coming close to death. But it happens to all people. It happens to people who are mentally healthy and people who are mentally ill. It happens to men, women, old people, young people, people of all kinds. And it happens to people who have no prior history of any mental illness or emotional troubles. So it's hard to imagine this being anything but a normal experience under unusual circumstances. As a psychiatrist, I always look for the psychological or emotional reasons for these things to happen. And of course, since they are unusual experiences that don't seem like our normal everyday life, I think about, were they expecting this to happen? Is this coming from their imagination? So I look at what they thought would happen to them before they had this experience. What did they think was going to happen when you die? And we find no connection at all between what they thought and what really happened. People who were deeply religious have the same experiences as people who were not religious at all. People who were confirmed atheists, who didn't believe anything about a deity or about an afterlife, have the same near-death experiences as people who are devout Catholics. And there seems to be no correlation between what you thought beforehand and what happens to you. In fact, many people who are religious say, what happened in my experience directly contradicts what my church was telling me. various studies done in the US and in the UK and in the Netherlands have found that at between 10 and 20% of people whose hearts stop, that is, people who are in hospital and we know that their hearts have stopped, 10 to 20% will report a near-death experience. That's a lot of people, but it's still a minority. That means 80 to 90% do not. Why not? We don't know the answer to that. We've looked at personality traits. We've looked at the physiological features, what's going on in the brain and in the heart while you're having this close brush with death, and we haven't found any way to predict who's going to have a near-death experience when they come close to death. Many near-death experiences include an out-of-body component where people feel they leave their physical bodies behind and are able to look at the body and see what's going on. But not all near-death experiences. But the out-of-body component gives us an opportunity to test the accuracy, the reality of the near-death experience. Because sometimes people who claim to leave their bodies can describe things very accurately from an out-of-body perspective when they were, as far as we can tell, completely unconscious, totally anesthetized, or nearly dead and unconscious. And they describe not only obvious things, but very unexpected things, like a nurse in the operating room having mismatched shoelaces. They describe things you wouldn't expect to see. And I've heard some very astounding stories about patients describing bizarre behavior from their doctors that you wouldn't ever expect them to do, and yet it turned out to be true. The out-of-body experience gives us one of the best ways of testing the reality. But there are other ways as well. For example, many people during a near-death experience report encountering deceased loved ones. Now that can easily be dismissed as expectation or wishful thinking in many cases. But we have a number of cases where people encountered deceased individuals that were not yet known to have died. So you can't say they expected them or wanted to see them. Many people who have near-death experiences and leave their bodies claim to be able to see things from an out-of-body perspective. And even though some of them are very surprising and accurate, they're not a controlled experiment. So it's hard to estimate. For example, if someone says, I saw the nurse having mismatched shoelaces, what are the odds of that happening? We don't know. So people have tried to do studies where they planted hidden targets in an operating room or a room where people are likely to have cardiac arrests in a hospital. And they usually put visual targets up high on a shelf above eye level. There have been, I believe, 6 published reports of this type of experiment, and they've only uncovered a total of 12 people who reported leaving their bodies, and none of them saw anything. That is, none of them saw the target, but none of them claimed to have seen the target and described it inaccurately, so it doesn't give us information. The largest study of this kind was done by Sam Parnia, originally a British doctor who's now in New York. And it was called the AWARE Project. And he put these targets in about 20 different hospitals in the UK and my hospital here at University of Virginia. And this sounded to me like a good way to study out-of-body experiences and near-death experiences. But when I describe this to near-death experiencers, they just laugh at it. They say, imagine yourself near death, suddenly finding yourself out of your body for the first time. You don't know what's going on. You're watching them trying to revive your body. Are you going to look around the room for some irrelevant target you didn't even know was there and try to remember it so you can tell someone about it later on? They say, there's no reason we should do that. So they think it's ridiculous to even try to do something like that. You would have to have a target that was really captivating for the individual patient, which means, for example, using their name on it or something that was relevant to them, which would be difficult to do for each individual patient. And then maybe in some way prepare them in advance to be looking for a target like this. Tell them there may be something unusual in the room, so if you do find yourself leaving your body, I want you to look for it. But that would be sort of biasing the patients beforehand. So I'm not sure that we have a good answer for how to study this scientifically. We really can't guess who's going to have one. We can try looking at people who are most likely to have near-death experiences, but again, the odds are very small, so it's really difficult to do. For example, people who have recurrent heart stoppages. But again, you don't know when they're going to have it, where they're going to have it, so it's very difficult to do. I was raised as a medical scientist, so I started looking for medical explanations for the near-death experience. And over the course of the last 50 years, I've seen dozens and dozens of explanations put forward. The most obvious one at first was a lack of oxygen to the brain, because no matter how you come close to death, one of the last things that happens is you stop getting oxygen to the brain. But we know from decades of clinical experience and some recent research that getting less oxygen to the brain does not produce a near-death experience. It makes you frightened, belligerent, confused, agitated, very different from the peaceful, calm near-death experience. Furthermore, studies done in the United States, in the United Kingdom, and in the Netherlands have looked at what is the oxygen level going on in the body at the time people come close to death. And they find that those people who report near-death experience actually have better oxygen supply to the brain when they have the NDE than people who don't have near-death experiences. So oxygen deprivation does not seem to be the cause. There have also been reports that increased carbon dioxide can produce it. Again, the data do not support that. There have been reports that chemicals or drugs given to people as they come close to death may cause these. But again, we find that the more drugs people are given, the less likely they are to report a near-death experience. It's tricky to look at the relationship between mind and brain, because in everyday life it seems like mind and brain are the same things. When you have too much to drink, you get intoxicated. That affects your thinking. Or when you have a stroke or something going wrong with your brain, that affects your thinking. So it seems as if your thoughts are created by the brain. But there are exceptional circumstances where the brain seems to be slowing down or stopping, and the mind seems to be flourishing, in fact, better than ever. So one model that's been proposed is that the brain does not create thoughts, but receives them from outside and filters them. My prejudice going into this was that something in the brain was going to explain near-death experiences. And we've looked repeatedly at different models, and we have not really found yet any explanation. Now, I should say that our knowledge about the brain and consciousness is still at a very early level. And we have much more to learn. And we may well find something eventually that can help us explain or at least understand what's going on in the NDE. If not what's causing it, at least what's allowing it to happen. But I think we don't have answers yet about that. Near-death experiences typically produce a wide range of changes in attitudes and beliefs and values, and with that goes behavior. The thing we hear most often is that people are no longer afraid of death or dying. Now, people vary according to how afraid they are of death, but when they come out of a near-death experience, they say, I'm not afraid of death anymore. When I first heard that as a psychiatrist, I worried about this making people suicidal. I thought, well, if you want to harm yourself, but you're afraid something might happen, if you learn nothing's going to happen, it's wonderful, why not do it? So we did a study of people who were admitted to the hospital with a suicide attempt, and we compared those who had a near-death experience as a result of the attempt and those who didn't. And to our surprise, we found that those who had a near-death experience were less suicidal when they recovered than people who didn't have NDEs. And that seemed unusual to me, so I asked them to explain to me why that is. And they said, well, I still have the same problems I had before, but now I see a meaning and purpose in life, in everything that happens. And I see that my problems are not something to run away from, but something to learn from. And they see them being as part of something greater than themselves, and their own personal problems are less important. So they have the same problems, but they have a different perspective on them now, which makes them less suicidal and makes life much more meaningful and enjoyable for them. The near-death experience does lead people to see life in a different way. They tend to be much more spiritual, and I don't mean religious by that, because some become much less religious, but they become much more spiritual in the sense of being much more connected to other people, to the natural world, to the divine in everyone, and that makes them much more compassionate. And they tend to live according to the golden rule, which is part of every religion we have. Do unto others as you would have them do unto you. But the near-death experiences say, for me, it's no longer a guideline we're supposed to follow. It's a law of nature. This is the way things are. In my experience, I experienced that when you hurt someone else, you're hurting yourself as well, because we're all interconnected. It's like the fingers on a hand. They look like they're different things, but if you cut one finger, the whole hand hurts, and you can't separate them. So they tend to be very changed when they come back. And often that means they need to change their careers. For example, I've known people who were career police officers or military officers who, after a near-death experience, could not shoot someone, even in self-defense. So they had to change their careers. And people who were in very competitive businesses who no longer thought it made sense to get ahead at someone else's expense either changed the way they worked or changed their professions. And they often go into a helping profession, healthcare, social work, teaching, clergy, and so forth. Now you would think that these are all wonderful changes, but they often make life very difficult for these people, especially if they've had a successful career in something that no longer has meaning for them, or if they've had a marriage based on certain things that no longer are meaningful to them. And I've seen many people struggle after a near-death experience trying to bring their lives into agreement with their new sense of values. But you tend to value life more after you've almost lost it. But you don't become more accepting of death. If you've had a near-death experience, you're no longer afraid of dying. But if you haven't had an NDE, you usually are more afraid of dying, which makes you more conservative, more cautious. Whereas if you've had a near-death experience, you're not afraid of dying, you're more outgoing, more willing to take risks. You jump into life with both feet. Eben Alexander was a neurosurgeon trained at Harvard. He was practicing here in Virginia at the time he had his near-death experience. He woke up one morning, very early morning, with a terrible headache, the worst he'd ever had. And he had a fever. His wife put him in the bathtub to cool him down, and he was not getting any better. She called the emergency rescue squad, and by the time they reached him, he was having seizures. They put him in an ambulance, rushed him to the hospital, and by that time, he was not making any sense and he was almost comatose, but he was still having seizures. So they gave him some medication to control the seizures, and that's kind of put him in a medically induced coma for a while. They have what they call the Glasgow Coma Scale, which they use in hospitals, and they measure that every 8 hours, every nursing shift. And his scores were very, very low, indicating severe brain damage. They did a CAT scan of his brain, which showed there was no structure in the brain anymore. The whole skull was filled with pus, so that you couldn't see anything in the brain anymore. The doctors thought that there's no point in doing an EEG because this is a dead man. He's never going to recover from this. They did cultures of his blood and found that he had a rare bacterial infection that 1% of people recover from. And those who recover usually have permanent brain damage. So they prepared his wife saying he's not going to live, and if he does, he's not going to be functional at all. He was in a coma for 6 days and then came out of the coma. And he awoke without language, without memories of his past life on Earth, but with vivid memories of his near-death experience. And as he gradually got back his ability to talk, he described this very vivid near-death experience. It included some features which are not typical of near-death experiences, and it includes some that were. He described being in another realm or dimension, a beautiful realm, and he described having a guide there, a beautiful woman he didn't recognize, who didn't speak to him, but conveyed to him unconditional love. When he eventually recovered, it took several months for him to recover. He apparently had no remaining neurological deficits. He seemed to recover completely, which totally stunned all his doctors and neurologists. He happened to have been adopted shortly at birth. His parents were college students who were not married. They gave him up for adoption. He was raised by Eben Alexander II. He was Eben Alexander III, and raised without knowing his family. In adulthood, he tried to seek out who his birth family was. And he went to the adoption agency, and they contacted the parents. And the parents at that time, his birth parents, had married, and had other children. And he met them. And he had a reasonable relationship with them. And at one point, he saw a photograph of the family. And there was a young woman there who was not in the family now, but he recognized that as the woman from his near-death experience. And he asked about this. And this was a sister he had had that he had never known, who had died in a car accident several years earlier. And that was the person that he claimed he saw in his near-death experience. So this is another example of meeting someone that you didn't know had died, you didn't even know existed. Now, of course, this is not a perfect case. We only have his word that this is the person he saw in his near-death experience. No one can corroborate that for him. There were people who tried to tear this story apart by saying that he's an unreliable witness. He wasn't really in a coma. He was in a medically induced coma. He wasn't really near death. So with his permission, I wrote to the hospital and got copies of his medical record, more than 600 pages of doctor's notes, nurses' notes, laboratory reports, CAT scans, and so forth. And I had 3 copies made. I scored one myself, and I gave it to 2 other physicians, and we each independently scored the medical records, correlating it with what was going on in his near-death experience at the time. And we thought that when we finished, we'd get together and compare notes and work out the differences. There were no differences. The medical record was crystal clear. He was in a coma before they gave him any medications. He came out of the coma while they were still giving him medications. So the medications were not causing the coma. He was having the most elaborate near-death experience features at a time when his Glasgow coma scale was near 0. So his brain was not functioning as far as anyone could tell, and yet he was having these elaborate experiences. He described seeing and hearing things in his near-death experience that were going around his hospital bed that he couldn't possibly have known about because he was in a deep coma, and yet he did. So in some ways, it's a atypical case of near-death experiences. In some ways, it has very profound features of a near-death experience. And again, it totally transformed his life. I also spoke with his son, who at the time was a college student, a pre-medical student at the university. And I asked him, as he was a neuroscience major, what do you make of this? And he says, I can't make any sense of it at all, but this is not the father I grew up with. He's totally changed. So that's an example of someone who was totally transformed by the near-death experience. I think we need to care about near-death experience, firstly because they change our view of the world, of how human beings fit into the world. And secondly, because they may give us clues to how the mind and the brain interact. Are they the same thing? Is one the product of another? Are they totally separate things that interact? And if so, how? We just don't have answers yet. As a scientist, I think we will someday. I don't know if it'll happen in my lifetime, but I think that if we put enough effort into this, we will eventually have answers.